Pre-polling has opened for the 2025 federal election. In a prior video, I talked about the Labour Party's election policies, but now I thought I would talk about the Liberals, to see what I think about the policies and what the Liberals are promising to do for Australians. And if you've got any thoughts about them, well, let me know that in the comments below. And in the interests of full disclosure, in a prior video as well, I talked about how I am likely to vote in this election, and I had put the Liberals first in my electorate. However, that doesn't mean that I'm all in on all of their policies, as you'll see in a little bit. Alright, so let's start off by talking about the Liberal Party's fiscal and tax policies, because here the Liberal Party has been a little bit wishy-washy in my opinion, where the Labour Party is intending to cut the tax rate for the lowest tax rate, cutting it down from 16% all the way down to 14%, saving people somewhere in the vicinity of $50 per week in about 18 months' time. The Liberal Party has gone a slightly different path. They've decided to cut the fuel excise. Now, they do this temporarily, but that would reduce potentially the amount of money people need to spend on fuel. And remember, when you're buying fuel, that's often an after-tax expense, so it could potentially save you quite a lot of money, potentially thousands of dollars if you drive a lot. However, it will save you absolutely nothing if you use public transport, or you walk, or you use a bicycle, or whatever it is. Basically, how much you save from the fuel excise cut will depend on your usage of cars, particularly cars with internal combustion engines. I don't necessarily dislike the fuel excise cut, but I don't think it really moves the needle for me. The other area of their tax policy is that they have highlighted that they would attempt to get on top of bracket creep sometime when the budget is repaired, maybe. Now, of course, it is important to get on top of bracket creep. After all, whenever your income goes up just with inflation, you move increasingly into higher marginal tax rates. Now, to give the Liberal Party credit here, they should get on top of bracket creep. However, let's not give them too much credit because they've said it's an aspiration when the budget is under repair, which might never actually occur because, say hypothetically the Liberal Party gets in this election, then they last one term. Well, even if they do try their best efforts to repair the budget, and that's a big if, it's hardly going to be repaired within the space of one term, and I don't see that as actually a realistic promise. However, it is better than the Labour Party, which hasn't even put that as an aspiration. The other areas where they're better than the Labour Party in tax policy are they are not increasing taxation on superannuation. As a reminder from my Labour Party video, well, the Labour Party has decided to double the tax rate on superannuation and to have a tax on unrealised capital gains on superannuation. Now, initially, that would only apply to superannuation balances above $3 million. However, A, that is not indexed, B, that could be easily lowered after the precedent is set, and therefore C, it could catch up all Australians. To put this in perspective, as I talked about in my Labour Party video, that $3 million sounds like a lot of money, but say the broader market is growing at 10% per year, which is realistic for the S&P 500 index, say it's growing at 10% per year. Well, that $3 million is really worth about $450,000 in 20 years' time, meaning more and more younger Australians are going to be caught up by this by the time they retire. I can't emphasize this enough. That increase on taxation for superannuation, it doesn't really impact baby boomers who often don't have $3 million. It impacts younger people because of how inflation and stock returns work. I can't emphasize that enough. And the Labour Party is trying to paint this as only affecting high-income earners, which is correct right now, but it will affect everyone in the future, especially all young people by the time they are retiring. Think about a 20-year-old retiring in 40 years' time. They're going to be impacted significantly by that policy. Another point of difference relates to property taxation. It appears the Labour Party wants to increase taxes on property. So much is clear from the fact that Jim Chalmers had asked Treasury for advice on removing so-called negative gearing. Presumably also he wants to increase the capital gains tax rate on property sales, in addition to the sale of myriad other financial assets. Again, this is clear from the Labour Party's trajectory so far. They took this policy to the 2019 election, they lost, but now it appears to be resurfacing itself. And indeed, if the Labour Party needs to make a deal with the Greens, one could easily see this coming back to fruition. Now, the Labour Party said they have no present intentions of changing property taxation. However, we heard that before when they talked about the Stage 3 tax cuts and also taxation on superannuation. The Liberal Party, by contrast, does not have any policies about increasing taxation on property, which creates a significant difference between the two parties. Now, to my mind, this is important because in Australia, wage growth is incredibly sluggish. Taxes are incredibly high. Property and investing is the only way you can achieve any semblance of financial freedom in Australia. If you're not investing, you're just going to become an indentured servant to the government and to your employer. The Labor Party, by seemingly wanting to increase taxes on investments, is effectively just dooming everyone to be an indentured servant of the government and their company. To use myself as an example, my wage has been cut 15% this year. This means that without investment, well, I'd just be going backwards forever. There'd be no way of getting ahead whatsoever. Employers are going to treat you like dirt. The government will treat you like dirt. Investments are the only way to possibly get ahead. And Jim Chalmers appears to be trying to take that away from people. So wrapping all of this up, the Liberal Party has not exactly been inspiring as it relates to tax policy, but they're certainly significantly less bad than Labour in my estimation. And with the topic of assets in mind, let's talk about housing policy. Now, both the Liberal Party and Labour Party have various iterations in the same basic theme for housing policy. As I mentioned in my Labour Party video, well, the Labour Party is intending to enable buyers, first home buyers that is, to purchase a house using only a 5% deposit, with the government effectively underwriting the lender's mortgage insurance. I actually quite liked that policy. I think it's perfectly okay. After all, getting that deposit is often one of the hardest problems of buying a house, and even if you can service the mortgage, well, it doesn't mean you can necessarily save for that deposit. So getting over the deposit hurdle is a big benefit for buyers. I quite like that. Furthermore, it benefits first home buyers without taking anything from anyone else. The Liberal policy has a similar type of theme to it, but gets at it through a different path, which is to enable the interest on mortgage to be tax deducted for first home buyers. And I'm generally all for lowering the amount of tax people are paying. This should obviously apply to people who already own their owner-occupied house as well. After all, it's ridiculous to just apply it to people going forward. It should also apply to, say, a young person who has already bought the house this year. The only area where I think this runs into a little bit of weirdness is an owner-occupied house is typically regarded as a personal use asset, like your own personal car or an iPhone or whatever it is that you're using for your own personal benefit. Therefore, it doesn't typically fall within that investment scope. However, as I've said before and alluded to in prior videos, I regard all property as inherently an asset, inherently an investment. And if you're not treating it as an investment, you run the risk of losing a lot of money. After all, you are borrowing to buy a house, often with mortgages in the vicinity of 90% of the value of the property, and if your property goes down in value, you're going to end up massively underwater. So if you're not thinking about the long-term value of that property, you really should be. The Liberal Party's policy is basically dealing with the servicing aspect of buying a house. The Labour Party policy is basically dealing with the deposit aspect of buying a house. They're dealing with two slightly different things. Ultimately, maybe a combination of the two would be beneficial. After all, Australia's tax rates are exorbitant, so anything to get those down is probably a good thing. However, of course, we do need to get on top of the spending side of it when we are reducing taxes, unless those tax cuts are inherently growth generating. The Liberal Party would also allow first home buyers to access up to $50,000 of the superannuation in order to purchase a property. However, it does subtly get on top of that deposit and stamp duty requirement. Now, while we're on the topic of stamp duty, I don't think we need broader reforms about that, because often the alternative proposal to stamp duty is a broad-based land tax. The problem with the land tax is that keeps going up every single year, as land values are deemed to increase. It's often better to just get the stamp duty over and done with than to have to pay a continued increase in the land tax every single year, which is a continued tax even when you have retired. It's better to just pay the stamp duty right now and get it over and done with. But that's a separate discussion. The other policy area is free speech. Now, throughout the election campaign, the Liberal Party has been relatively silent on free speech. I've seen few election promises in relation to this. Perhaps I've missed these. You can let me know if you think I've missed anything, but I've seen relatively little commentary on this. And this is probably not hugely surprising, because the Liberal Party needed to be dragged kicking and screaming toward resisting the so-called misinformation and disinformation law. It was eventually defeated. However, it took a lot, and the Liberal Party really took its time getting there, which was one of my big bugbears with Peter Dutton. But at least they resisted it in the end, and at least they did listen to public outcry about it, although they should have had a backbone from the very beginning. The Liberal Party also went all in on that under 16-year-old social media ban, which I think is perhaps going to be unworkable. But the big issue of this, of course, is that to verify whether someone is under 16, you need to verify the age and identity of everyone, which effectively creates an identity check for all Australians, regardless of how old they are, which I think is a bigger problem. And I think the Liberal Party should have gone against that policy and explained why. I think the Liberal Party has been less bad on free speech than the Labour Party. After all, they did not move forward with that misinformation and disinformation bill. They did not support the misinformation and disinformation bill, so they're clearly less bad than the Labour Party. But that doesn't mean that they are perfect, and they could easily improve in this area. The next issue is in relation to health. Now, I haven't seen a lot of major policy announcements for the Liberals, but they have promised to invest similar amounts of money into Medicare as Labour have done. They've argued they'd do it more efficiently, which may or may not be the case. After all, Labour is trying to argue that you'll be able to see a GP for free without using a credit card, which is patently ridiculous. Because like I said in my prior video on the Labour Party's policies, the lion's share of the increase in the Medicare rebate would only apply to GP clinics that only bulk bill, and because of the reduction in income, no GP clinic will switch to doing that because they would lose money. The Labour Party policy is simply unrealistic and unworkable. You won't be able to see a GP for free, and the Labour Party is lying whenever they tell you that you can. The Liberal Party has also made some promises around the edges with mental health. I regard those as not really moving the needle for the vast majority of voters. The next area is energy. Now, the Liberal Party's main energy policies are really twofold in my opinion. The first one, which has obviously gotten the most attention and is the bigger of the two, is effectively rolling out nuclear power plants. Now, it appears that many of these nuclear power plants would at least initially be state-owned. I'm not sure whether they would ultimately be privatized. I guess that would depend upon what price they could get for the assets. Now, I'm not generally a fan of state-owned assets because often state-owned enterprises are incredibly inefficient and just soak up tons of money from the government. I've seen this with things like the NBN, which is massively inefficient and is just a black hole for cash. We see this in myriad other countries where state-owned enterprises are just a trash fire. So I'm not necessarily sure that state-owned nuclear power plants are the way to go. However, I do think in the beginning, at least the first power plant would probably need to be state-owned as a proof of concept so that investors have confidence that A, nuclear power plants are here to stay, and B, it has been demonstrated that the government is at least amenable to the regulations associated with opening up nuclear power plants. Now, that is their main area of policy. Now, I don't necessarily have a view here nor there about whether I like or dislike nuclear power. I think it's a discussion that we need to have. I don't think we should ideologically ban nuclear power. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's the best source of energy. I think it's just one that needs to be considered in the energy mix and considered realistically. After all, many other countries have nuclear power, including the United States, France, etc. When Germany switched off its nuclear power plants, it became incredibly reliant on Russia for its energy, so therefore we need to consider nuclear power plants, even if we don't necessarily use very much of them. And that would also include when they become more viable, small modular reactors, when those are really up to speed for being able to be utilized. The other aspect of the coalition's energy policy is to keep more gas at home and prevent gas from being exported, or at least some gas from being exported. So they've got more of a domestic supply of gas. Again, I'm not really a big fan of this policy. However, I can see how it plays out, i.e., their plan is to prevent gas companies from exporting up to 15% of the gas that they would be getting. Now, the purpose here is to try to create a domestic store of gas so we don't have gas shortages. The problem with this, of course, is it basically enables the government to pay below market rates, effectively forcing the gas companies to eat a loss on any of these things. Now, people might be saying that, well, gas should be like this, but think about it this way. Say you're running a small business, or really any business. How would you feel if the government says, well, you need to give us 15% of whatever it is you're producing at a below market rate? Say you're running a coffee shop, and the government says, well, you need to give coffee to all of the government employees at $1 per cup. Well, how would you feel as a small business if they were to say this? I'm not really enthralled with the government simply telling business that you must receive a below market rate for your goods. Broadly, the Liberal Party seems to be more open to things like gas in the energy mix and a more sensible rollout of renewables. So in general, I'd probably lean toward the Liberals' policies for energy. However, like I've said, they aren't exactly perfect. In terms of Indigenous policies, well, the Liberal Party doesn't have that much of a policy in relation to Indigenous issues. Obviously, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price would likely be involved in that. After all, she was front and centre of the voice referendum campaigning here. She has called for things such as an audit of funding going to Indigenous entities, which, I mean, makes sense. After all, you want to make sure that the money is being spent appropriately. And it could be that these entities have been entirely appropriate, or it could be that money has been frauded off. Obviously, we need to determine that because we as taxpayers are effectively funding a number of these entities. So, I mean, it makes some sense there. Furthermore, they have indicated they do more things on the ground for Indigenous communities. We're a little bit vague in relation to this because I don't think that's been front and centre of their campaign. However, of course, they would not do a treaty, and they would not do a Makarrata Commission, and they would not do any of these other things that Labor has effectively pushed us down the road of. After all, Labor has already earmarked funding for this Makarrata Commission and for exploring a treaty, so Labor clearly wants to go down that path, even though the voice was overwhelmingly defeated. The Liberal Party has decided to really just not move down that path. It has not been front and centre of their campaign at all. The next aspect is the public service. Now, the Liberal Party has been a little bit all over the place in relation to their policies about the public service. On the one hand, they've argued they try to cut the public workforce. However, they then worked this back by saying that, well, they just let the public workforce decrease via attrition, i.e. when people are retiring, they just don't replace them. Furthermore, at one point, they wanted all public servants to return to the office. However, they then walked this back. Now, I have mixed views about this. The public service probably is a little bit bloated in some areas. However, I would tackle it in a very different way from how the Liberal Party is looking at tackling it. I would tackle it by trying to increase incentives for public servants to be more efficient and create more value, and make these incentives credible. So the public servant could be paid a lot of money if he or she does a brilliant job. I have no problem paying them private sector wages if they're doing a great job. I think that makes sense. And that's the problem in the public service at the moment. They don't have the incentives properly lined up. So for a public servant, they might be intrinsically motivated to do a great job. However, intrinsic motivation only gets you so far. Intrinsic motivation and joy doesn't pay your mortgage. It doesn't pay your healthcare bills. It doesn't pay for the groceries. You need to give people incentives to do a good job. You need to enable people to get career advancement. And if you credibly enable that, then you're going to get people doing a better job. Furthermore, I think more linkages between the public sector and the private sector would make sense, so that public servants can have a credible outside option, moving to, say, a consultancy or whatever, and then back to the public service without taking a massive pay cut, so that people upskill and can move between these jobs, which gives them more hope for career advancement, which encourages people to work harder. I'm more in favour of using the carrot rather than the stick as a source of motivation. And I don't think just saying, well, we'll potentially fire tons of people is great for motivation. I don't think saying, go back to the office or you're fired is great for motivation. And say you've got an efficient person who is really good at their job. They might work from home and say work fewer hours and get the same amount of work done as someone who is in the office and just procrastinating all of the time. Now, those were the main policies that really stuck out to me, but if you think I've missed anything, well, you can let me know that in the comments below. In terms of which person I think is a, quote, better Prime Minister between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, it would be Peter Dutton, but I hardly find him particularly inspiring. The problem we have with Peter Dutton has been consistent throughout his term as opposition leader. He dithers and he prevaricates too much, as like he is waiting for focus groups to tell him what the electorate thinks before making a decision. We saw this with the voice referendum. I was not particularly happy with how long he dithered on this. He basically should have come out straight away and said that he would oppose it. We saw this with the budget reply speech, where he should have just said, we will lock in the lower marginal tax rate and we will go further by attempting to tackle bracket creep and by not increasing your taxes on superannuation. But he simply has no cut through. I think as a personal leader, he seems nice enough. He seems a little bit taciturn. He seems a little bit like, well, a former police officer, I guess. He seems nice enough. I feel like he's probably a good person. However, he simply doesn't have cut through. He needs to do some media training or something. So those are my thoughts about the Liberal Party's policies for the 2025 federal election. Obviously, your vote is your own. You can vote however you want, based on whichever policies you think are important. Perhaps you disagree with my analysis, in which case, well, let me know that in the comments below. Maybe you think I'm being too hard to Peter Dutton and too harsh on some of the policies. Maybe you think that I'm spot on. Personally, I'm more libertarian-leaning, so there are areas of the Liberal Party's policy platform that I'm not especially fond of. But To my mind, they are less bad than the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is promising to increase taxation on superannuation, which is going to be a massive increase that is going to affect all young people by the time they retire. I cannot emphasize that enough. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Who do you think is the better party?